This video is on conditional statements, and we're going to talk about what conditional statements are and how they apply to what we're doing. So, for starters, a conditional statement is a statement that can be written in the form if P then Q. Which looks like that. We can also write that with a simple arrow. So you might see it like this, P and then arrow Q. There we go. Q. Okay. So if P then Q is what we're talking about. So we're going to be talking about statements where it's basically an if-then statement. We're going to use P's and Q's a lot throughout this conversation. P is always going to stand for what we call the hypothesis. So P and we want to stay with lowercase because that's what we're talking about. P is the hypothesis. It's always the part that comes after the if and before the then. So in an if-then statement, the hypothesis comes after the if and before the then. And then Q is what we call the conclusion. And the conclusion comes after the then. So just some examples. If a butterfly has a curved wing, has a curved black line on its hind wing, then it is a viceroy. Okay? So the hypothesis in this case would be if a butterfly has a curved black line on its hind wing, the conclusion would be then it is a viceroy. So that makes up a conditional statement. That whole if-then makes up a conditional statement. A conditional statement has what we call a truth value. And there's two options. It is either true or it is false. Okay? Those are our possible truth values. Those are it. True or false. And so truth value is going to depend on the hypothesis and the conclusion being true or false. So for instance, if we make a little table of truth value, we can say if P then Q is our conditional statement. If P and Q are true, then the whole statement is true. If P is false, then no matter what Q is, the whole statement is true. If P is true and Q is false, then the statement is false. And that's just a basic table of the truth values. So if P and Q are true, they're both true. If P is false, true. If P is true and Q is false, false. They're both false. Okay, so let's talk about some of the variations on a conditional statement. So a conditional statement can have a negation. In a negation, that's basically just not P or not Q. Okay, those are negations. And that's represented typically by what we call a tilde. So let's make my line a little bit thinner so it doesn't look quite so garish. So we can write that as not P or not Q. Those are negations. So there are related conditional statements using negations and switching hypothesis conclusion to create different statements. So let's start off with an original statement. Let's say if it is Tuesday, then we have math. Okay, there's a conditional statement. So this is our conditional statement, and we notice if it is Tuesday is our hypothesis, our conclusion is then we have math. Okay, so we're going to go through some other related conditional statements. So if that's our original conditional statement, we start with what we call the converse, not like the shoe. Okay, and the converse is formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. So instead of P then Q, it's going to be if Q then P, which is if we have math, then it is Tuesday. That's the converse. There's also the inverse. The inverse is created by negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So in this case, it would be if it is not, right, the negation, Tuesday, then we don't have math. See how I've negated both the hypothesis and the conclusion? That's the inverse. Finally, we have what's called the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is the combination of the converse and the inverse. So we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, and we're going to negate both. If we don't have math, then it is not Tuesday. Okay, that's the contrapositive. Now the truth value for these are related. If the conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive is necessarily also always true. Okay? That truth says nothing about the converse and the inverse. So if the conditional statement is true and the contrapositive is true, the converse and inverse are not necessarily true. However, if the converse is true, then the inverse is also true. So these two are linked, and the conditional statement and the contrapositive are linked. But there's no link between the conditional statement and the converse, or the conditional statement and the inverse, or the contrapositive in those two.